It's day 7 of the Advent calendar, my friends. Yesterday we talked about time pressure and aggression, sectoids and gatekeepers, and engagement ranges. Today we'll talk about strategic awareness, archons and sectopods, and tactical awareness.
The time has come to reclaim our world. Welcome back, Commander.
Incoming transmission.
Day 7, strategy, strategic awareness. Strategic awareness should bring flashbacks to my cascading decisions topic. Basically, strategic awareness means constantly updating your optimal course of events. You want to keep in mind all of the strategic factors influencing your decisions. So it's basically a reality check that you perform every time you think about doing something and you say, wait, do I need these supplies for something else? And it's how many steps you can think into the future that really increases the effectiveness of your strategic awareness. You're like, you know what, I could spend these supplies to gain a nice little bonus before this mission. That would be great. But if you think, oh, this is a black site mission, it's going to be extra hard, I should save supplies in case I need to purchase another specialist. What if my specialist is wounded on this mission? Or I'm taking my 2 last unwounded specialists, and if one of them gets wounded, then my squad's going to be a man down on the next mission. And I might have to go back to HQ and purchase a new one if I really want to play with my optimal squad. So the idea is, the better idea you have of the effects on you and how they're going to require you to spend your resources, the more aware of your situation you're going to be. Optimally, of course, you want to expand towards black sites and destroy them as quickly as possible. You want to gather resources with minimal time wastes, and you want to continuously improve your tactical game. So what are the effects that are going to hinder you? Easily, dark events are going to cause serious strategic problems, though you can tend towards letting dark events pass you that cause strategic difficulties if you're on top of your strategic game, and save yourself some that cause you tactical problems if you are on top of your tactical game, and then your strategic game can be significantly eased. Hunter UFOs, the way they work apparently is that a hunter UFO will appear and it will run around various regions, and you kind of have to avoid it. Now this can waste a lot of your time, but apparently it's not as scary as it sounds of a dark event. It doesn't indicate an immediate base defense like was suggested in one of the live streams that Garth DeAngelis did. So that can inconvenience you, but if you're on top of your tactical game and you've got strategic slack, go ahead and take it. Targets of opportunity are going to take up your time. Those are the logistics operations where all you need to do is spend time. You don't have to go on a tactical mission, and you can acquire new resources for yourself. Sure, these are good opportunities, but they're going to interfere with expanding towards black sites and destroying them. However, they're likely worth it, so it's going to be up to you to know if you have the slack in your strategic game to deal with it. Tactical missions, of course, also you want to prevent some of those dark events, but maybe you have to go backwards to prevent the dark event you really want, and instead you really need to be pushing forwards. Hard to say, you're going to have to judge for yourself, but just keep everything in mind. Lastly, you're going to need to prepare for the more difficult missions, especially the plot-oriented ones. So you might need to actually hold off on expanding until you've researched the next tier of weapons or a better suit of armor. If a new enemy type appears, that's going to require you to research up, and if you're significantly behind, you may have to play it safe on the strategic side because you can't fight the most difficult tactical battles with your current level of upgrades. So stay focused. Remind yourself constantly of everything that's affecting how you play, and consider each alternative so that you come up with the best plan. that's going to be what nails strategic awareness in your playthrough of XCOM 2. So I think in general, the strategic game is a lot looser than the tactical game in XCOM, the remakes at least. So the strategic game favors making solid decisions based on your current circumstances and doesn't require too much predictive effort. The best players, of course, will put some effort into predicting what they think will happen in the strategic game, what type of enemies might pop up next, preemptively researching like anti-poison or high armor, high health armors when you start seeing mutons or you think berserkers are going to show up, or of course the dreaded Sectopod is going to pop up. You're going to need health to tank a shot, or you're going to start losing people instantaneously, which will be brutal. So do try and think ahead. XCOM probably won't require too much of you. It's always had a more simple strategic game than tactical. But you can bet that the mods people come out with, Long War in particular for XCOM, Enemy Unknown and Enemy Within, pretty much negated that and made the strategic game just as difficult, if not a little more difficult than the tactical game, depending on the difficulty you were playing. So expect to hone your strategic awareness lest you find yourself in the pits surrounded by God knows what.
Incoming transmission.
Day 7, Tactics, Archon, and Sectopod. So let's talk about some of the more dangerous units you're going to face in XCOM 2. And when I say dangerous, I mean relatively to when you encounter them. Obviously, a Sectopod is going to be more dangerous than an Archon. But the Archon, I think, is, I mean, unless Archons have changed a lot, we have not seen or heard too much about the Archon. We know it's a floater with a facelift. And in the Retaliation trailer, we've seen it launch a missile swarm similar to what the Sectopod used to launch, which makes it, I mean, that's a pretty intimidating ability, which kind of suggests that maybe that Archon was on the level of difficulty of like a heavy floater plus, which could make them quite dangerous. And if that ability is long-ranged enough, it could easily make them more annoying than a Sectopod. So the Archon is going to be dangerous for a couple reasons. It's a mobile, airborne unit with a large AoE rocket attack and presumably a pretty standard blastery type attack. You can expect it to be aggressive, accurate, and threatening, primarily due to its ability to fly, but the AoE rocket attack, if that's present on all of the Archons, is pretty brutal looking and definitely worth scaring you out of your position. Definitely worth a fighting withdrawal just to avoid. So flight allows units to ignore cover. They don't need it. It generally gives them a defense boost, which can make them more difficult to target. It negates and or gives them height advantage over your units. Like your sniper up on a roof probably isn't going to have height advantage over an Archon that's flying, whereas the flying Archon will probably have height advantage over anyone who's not at the highest level on the map. They can often be difficult to hit with grenades, and they have near perfect vision, which helps them and the rest of the alien units. So how do you deal with something like this? The Archon is going to be easy to target with all of your squad. It's going to be flying. There's going to be no line of sight blockers. It's going to be all the way up in the air. Side debuffs are an excellent way to deal with the raw buffs. So height advantage in XCOM Enemy Within was worth 20 aim. 20 aim. That's a 20% increased chance to hit. That's a huge amount, and that's what's going to make the Archon's regular attack significantly deadlier than other enemies. It's going to be way more accurate when it's flying above you. So canceling out those buffs with psi powers is going to be really easy. Generally the Archons, I wouldn't expect them to have really high willpower, but hey. Another one is pulling back. if they're really going to act as aggressively as the old floaters did, then pulling backwards away from other units and dealing with them in detail is the way to go. Plus, when you pull back, you generally end up in better positions than anywhere else. When you're pushing forwards, you're forced to take certain positions based on line of sight control and enemy positions. But when you're pulling back, you kind of get the pick of the litter and can take any of the cover spots you want with the threat you're facing in mind. So pulling back, very strong tactic, especially against really aggressive units. You can also expect them to run your Overwatch pretty well because their natural defense is still in effect even when they're moving. And Overwatch generally is balanced against units that need cover to defend themselves. So they're going to be difficult to ambush because, for one, they're almost never going to be out of cover, double quotation marks, because they're simply flying. But if you get the chance and a flying unit is on the ground and easy to kill, take it, because that is your best opportunity. So, if the Archon's deadly because of height advantage, that makes the Sectopod doubly, perhaps triply dangerous. The new Sectopod, just revealed on January 11th, looks incredibly intimidating. It's still a super heavy armored mechanical unit. It now has a interesting height variability feature that's going to let it squeeze into places you wish it wouldn't. And along with that comes a shin splint attack, kind of like, imagine if it had a ground stomp, but they didn't have time to animate the whole thing. It'll have heavy magnetic weaponry mounted on its shoulder, and it has a devastating 2-round main cannon attack that charges for 1 round and fires the next, cutting a huge swath across the map. So that's all of the abilities we saw. We saw someone hack it, so that's pleasant, that you can hack them and use them against enemies. And we didn't see the AoE rocket barrage ability that was so devastating on the last Sectopod. And it didn't seem like it could fire twice, but it would be hard to tell from the short clips we've seen. Remember that the old Sectopod could fire twice if it didn't move, and had a reactive fire cannon on its back that would, if it fired its primary cannon, give it Overwatch instantaneously. Now, that ability may still exist on the Sectopod. I wouldn't be too surprised. It does have all these weapons on it. It's bristling, and it's incredibly tough. So, how are you going to deal with this unit's high damage, area of effect attacks, and incredible durability? Well, let's draw on our previous knowledge of how to deal with Sectopods. Number 1, you want good defense. I mean the actual defense stat, because the thing about the Sectopod is its abilities are basically extra deadly versions of like the basic Advent Trooper. Like, it does a lot of damage. It's got way better aim. Due to its leg variability, it can often have height advantage unless it needs to squeeze into some lower floor of a building where it can get at you, which is creepy and intimidating and weird and terrifying. And awesome. I forgot awesome. So in general, you want to keep your defense high. And the best way to do that is to definitely avoid close range combat with it. If the shin splint attack wasn't enough, which does like 10 to 12 damage, just like its main cannon attack, possibly its heavy cannon on its shoulder does a little bit less, but you can expect to do pretty much 8 to 12 damage to anyone it hits at least. If all of that wasn't enough to ensure that you don't want to be close to it, stack the aim bonus with height advantage, and it's just going to annihilate you if you are nearby. So you want to fight at medium, preferably long range, like the maximum extent of rifle range or more. So it's going to close in aggressively on you. It's got armor, it doesn't care about cover, and apparently doesn't have trouble walking through the environment much, even though it's got a much bigger shadow than other units. you're going to want to be mobile to stay away from it. You're going to need to pull back, and you're going to need to use armor shredding attacks turn after turn to wear it down. The one we saw had 5 armor and almost 40 hit points, maybe exactly 40 hit points. I couldn't count them all. And you're going to have to concentrate fire and just pour fire into this thing. Hacking, obviously, is going to help. Anything you can do to debuff mechanical units is going to help. And from what we've seen, yeah, I don't think it has any other real tricks up its sleeves, as opposed to where the trooper has very low stats, low damage, low health, low aim. You can expect the Sectopod to kind of be the ultimate form of this, the paragon of its kind. It's going to do tons of damage. It has really good aim, often with the height bonus, and it's really incredibly tough. But that's all it's got. If you can dodge its attacks, you'll take no damage, and you're good. If you can shred through its armor and hit it enough, it'll die. So the real threat comes when this is combined with sneakier enemies, like, oh god, who knows? Ethereals, of course, or just plain other situations where you can't effectively deal with just the Sectopod. Anything you can do to lower its accuracy and dodge its attacks is going to be what you need to use when you encounter one of these puppies. Careful of any other tricks, but I don't think the Sectopod is going to be quite the devastating unit that it was before. Partially, I think because hacking is going to be so prevalent that this unit can't be quite as deadly. Before, you could never, ever gain control of a Sectopod because all you had was mind control and they're mindless. Now that you can take control, and expect the devs to have toned them back a bit so that you can really enjoy running rampant with one, but they're not going to be the end-all be-all of the mechanical tree. Or if they are, expect horrifically bad psi-focused enemy units to pop up later in the game. Worse than the Gatekeeper.
Transmission.
Day 7, Disposition, Tactical Awareness. So tactical awareness is just the same as strategic awareness, but there are a lot more variables, a lot more nuance in the tactical game than there are in the strategic game. So when I think tactical awareness, my first thought is knowing what could happen on the next turn, and even maybe the turn after that. It's pretty hard to predict 2 turns in a row with a lot of variables in play, but the fewer things you're dealing with at once, the better you're going to be able to predict what could happen. And probably the better those outcomes are going to be, because the more you have to deal with, the worse you're going to do as a human, and of course as a player of XCOM, since the more that's going on, the worse it is for you. You always have just your squad. So the way the game increases what happens is generally a bunch of enemies showing up. So the first thing you should think about are what threats remain. And I'm not just talking about the ones you can see and that you're currently engaging, but also on the map. Whenever I make a tactical decision, it's based off of what threats remain on the map. If I'm engaging enemies, the most dangerous thing, and I've said this before, is triggering more than one pod at a time. Because that's when the enemy doubles in strength or triples in strength at once, and you have to get really, really sneaky to cut the chance of that happening down if you want to become a great player. So think about threats remaining. An example of this would be when you decide to engage your first pod. Hopefully you're doing it from concealment, nothing blew your cover, but you never know. When you engage that first pod, you want to kill it as quickly as possible. It's definitely worth blowing a couple of limited use abilities, especially if they're just cooldown abilities, immediately to ensure that that pod dies in 1 or 2 rounds. The reason for this is, think about how many pods are on a map. Say there are 4 pods on a map, and they're evenly distributed across the map. So there's one in each quadrant of the map. Each one has 25% of the map. If they are wandering around, and the XCOM pods are certainly going to move, then the chances of one of them wandering into the firefight you're already in are much higher the more of them there are. So as soon as you kill that first pod, that gives you a quarter of the map where enemies can't be. I mean, maybe they'll double up or maybe they'll spread out, but it definitely buys you a bunch of space you can use to set up your next ambush. And once you've killed 2 squads, you're probably going to do pretty well in the mission. Dealing with the enemies piecemeal, 1 pod at a time, is easy. Dealing with the pods all at once is how you lose a tactical mission. Now sometimes, you know, the pods are just too brutal, or you didn't expect it, or you got caught by a really nasty attack or an unfortunate roll of the die. But in general, all of my major losses, and I'm a pretty good player, have come from getting swarmed by 2 or 3 pods at once. And I found that just annihilating that first pod as fast as possible without actually advancing while keeping my line of sights to the minimum possible area is the key to success on every mission. So, threats remaining. After you think about that, you want to think about your positioning and your line of sight. At the beginning of the game, when you're concealed, you can have a lot of line of sight. But before you engage that first pod, you want to constrict your line of sight down to just small enough to engage the pod you need with all the firepower you have. Engage the pod you're attacking. Once you kill that first pod, you can consider spreading out a bit more to get your second contact. But when you engage that first pod, don't be spread all over the place. That's going to make it much more likely that one of your troopers off to the left or one of your troopers off to the right is going to bring a whole nother pod crashing down onto you. And the further you're spread out, the more likely that second or third pods can actually flank you pretty quickly. So keep that line of sight narrow and small as possible, especially when engaging your first pod, and take it down as fast as you can. So then I think about, what limited use abilities do I have? Things on cooldown aren't so bad to blow. You can use them whenever you're in a tight spot, or they'll help. But try even to preserve them, because you never know when you're going to need that lightning hands shot. Don't just use it when it would be nice to use. You might kind of want to save it when it's the only thing that's going to get the job done. Your grenades and explosives, you want to be extra careful with. You can't replace those. You can't replenish those, as far as we know. And you need to save them for the appropriate moment. Sure, a grenade might really help you rock that first squad, but if you really got the jump on them, you're in a good position, and you don't think other enemies are going to pop in, don't waste it. Same for anything else with limited use. Medikits, like if someone takes a hit, well, it depends on how many charges of medikits you have. If you have way too many charges, go ahead and use one. If your charges are limited, you might save them just for stabilizing dead people. And you might let him walk around with 6 points off his armor. It's better than letting someone die later in the mission because so-and-so had just had to be topped up for no, particular reason. So save all your charges. There might be situations later where you need them more desperately. Now, if you know you're in a place where it's the last pot of enemies and that medikit's not going to do you any good once you finish the mission, go ahead and use it immediately. When those last couple advent reinforcements are dropping down, feel free to use everything you have left, as long as you're sure. Okay, so after considering limited use abilities, you're going to want to consider what debuffs are on your people, or what buffs. What makes them more or less effective at what you normally do with them? Or are they able to do something new? Like, can you hack now? Once you've covered the basics, that is what threats there are, where you are, and what you can see, and should you or should you not use limited abilities, then consider what you're actually good at, and then look at the probabilities that different things are going to work. So all of this is the basic structure of what I consider to be tactical awareness, the ability to react intelligently to the threats you're facing. The main things you don't want to let happen are have enemies join the fray, run Overwatch unless you need to help other soldiers survive or position themselves, or advance when you only have a few actions left across your whole squad. When you advance into unknown territory and you think you might trigger a squad, you want to do it with maybe your first or second soldier. After that, do not advance anywhere that other soldiers haven't already seen. If you risk activating extra pods with, say, your last trooper, they're going to swarm in on you and destroy you on the alien's next turn. So do keep mental track of about how many enemies you expect to be on the map and how many you've killed. This will give you a better idea of how much you can spread out, how much line of sight control is needed, and what's the worst that could happen. Also, kill enemy squads as fast as possible. It just can't be overstated. And if you're not on a timer, you've completed the primary objective or whatever, then feel free to wait out debuffs and penalties that are on a timer themselves, because there's no need going into combat poisoned when you could just wait it out before you advanced. Alright friends, that's it for day 7. If you enjoyed this content, please go ahead and like this video. If you'd like to see the next Advent Calendar video as soon as it comes out, please subscribe to my channel. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about guerrilla tactics upgrades, mutons and berserkers, and what constitutes good positioning.